Hey everybody, it's Ellen Lewis from Crazy for You. Good evening, how are you? It is nice to see you. Tonight I am talking about something that is, it shouldn't be, but it's a little on the controversial side. It is swatching. There are so many people out there that don't swatch, and I wanted to kind of take a look tonight at some of the reasons that people don't swatch and maybe just talk a little bit about swatching and get your input on it and maybe dispel some of the myths around swatching. So who's ready? Let's get started. Let me just say a quick hey to everybody. Hey, Jal and Sandy and Diane. So nice to see you. So good. I'm excited. So we are live on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram. So that is very, very happy. So tell me in the chat real quick, do you swatch for a sweater? Because, you know, I'm all about the sweaters, and I understand if you don't want to swatch for a garter stitch scarf or whatever. But generally speaking, when you have kind of a larger project, especially a garment, do you swatch? Because I'm interested in knowing that. It's so funny because I've done some. Well, obviously, having the store for 20 years, I've heard it all about swatching. But just this week, I was sort of looking at Reddit, which I try to stay away from. But some of the people whose attitude about swatching was so cavalier, and it was really kind of interesting. It's like they made not swatching their whole personality with knitting. And then there were other people who were like so obsessive about it. And I thought, you know, let's talk about this. Okay, so let's see what everybody says. All right, Diane, yes, I swatch. Hey, Maria, nice to see you. Yes, I swatch. Yes, absolutely. I have swatched, but I find it tedious. Maria Adams, no, you don't swatch. Okay, Jal, I swatch. I swatch for a sweater, but generally not for scarves or my recent poncho project. Okay. I have swatched and have difficulty. All right. Polly says she swatches, but only recently started blocking her swatches. Okay, good. Well, I think we have some interesting stuff to talk about. Mary, yes, for everything that needs to fit. Absolutely, 100%. Sally Melville is, you know, she's an old school designer, and she was designing back in the day. And I remember her, I guess it was the Knit Stitch book. She said, you either swatch or you give your finished garment to whoever it fits. And I thought, well, that's kind of it. Or you rip it out, right? So, okay, so let's look. Of course, I made you a little presentation. So we'll have fun with this, right? Okay, knitting a gauge swatch, fact versus myth. So what are some of the reasons that people don't swatch? I always get gauge. I love this one, okay? When people say, I always get gauge. What does that even mean anyway? I always get gauge. Nowadays, with so many independent designers and people, they're just one-man shows and they're putting their patterns out there on Ravelry. The size needle that they use is not necessarily indicative of the size of needle that the majority of people knitting that yarn are going to use to get that gauge. You know what I'm saying? So back in the day when patterns were designed by pattern companies or they had a different approach to it, there was a way of saying what gauge what needle a pattern and needed for that project with that yarn, okay? And the size that they put out there, the size needle that they recommended, wasn't based on the size that the test knitter used to get gauge. It was based on the size that a majority of people, you know, 100 people would knit that yarn and that pattern with that needle, you know, to get that gauge. What size needle would they use? So if you gave 100 people a required gauge and a yarn, 80 of them would use, say, size 7. Okay, there'd be some people that would need a 6. There would be some people that would need an 8, but the majority of them would need this size in the middle, and that's the size they put on the pattern. But when you have an independent designer, they might knit very loosely or very tightly, and they're simply going to tell you what size needle they used to get gauge. And that has really no bearing on what size needle you're going to need to get gauge. So I would have to say that this one is, whoops, this one's a myth. Okay, so I say that's not a thing, right? I always get gauge, yeah. Because different yarns, especially nowadays with the modern yarn constructions, I always point to chainette yarns, which typically need a larger needle than an equivalent weight yarn that is plied, because those chainette yarns are super bouncy and they tend to stretch around the needle. So you really do need to try it and see, especially if you're changing yarn. So that's a myth. I'm pretty confident on that. All right, next we have, it's a waste of time I could be spending on my project. Okay. You might not have time to knit the gauge swatch, but I promise you that if it doesn't fit, you're going to have time to rip the whole thing out and do it again. Has anybody done that? How many times have I seen people say, well, I knit it and it didn't fit, so, or my gauge was off, so I just ripped the whole thing out. I don't know about you, but I find that incredibly demoralizing. It's so quick and easy to make a little swatch, and I understand the excitement about getting started, but honestly, I really think that if you don't like doing the gauge swatch and it's such a waste of time, isn't knitting the whole thing at the wrong gauge and having it come out badly a worse waste of time? That's just my opinion, but there you go. So yes, I would say that is a myth. Okay? Am I on track with everybody here? What do you guys think? Have you ever not swatched and knit something and been super disappointed with that? I think maybe we all kind of have at some point. Let's see. Sandy says, yes, even when I have completed a gauge swatch. Okay, well, that's going to bring us to one of our topics that we're going to look at in a minute. Swatches aren't accurate. Okay. So this is a toughie. I think I'm going to go back to this a minute here. So I would say that swatches aren't accurate. Some truth. I'm going to give that a some truth, because swatches can absolutely not be accurate. There are so many things that go into that, right? We tend to approach a small width of knitting differently than we do a large width of knitting, which is why a lot of people will tell you to knit a really big gauge swatch. But if you're knitting a really huge gauge swatch, I don't know, you might as well just cast on. So I am of the 4 to 6 inch gauge swatch camp. But here's the thing about gauge swatches that are or are not accurate. The gauge swatch is accurate relative to where you're knitting it. So when we're knitting a gauge swatch, if we know that we have a tendency to knit a little bit loose or to knit a little bit tight, our gauge swatch is when we're on our best behavior. We are aware that we're a tight knitter, we're aware that we're a loose knitter, and we consciously try to counteract that in our gauge swatch. I believe that it's like that first date with somebody. Everybody's on their best behavior. They're not really being themselves. I use the whole dating thing, the dating comparison with gauge swatch, because I think it's such a good analogy. You know, that gauge swatch is when you're really putting your best foot forward. You want to make a good impression, and you're just doing your best to do what you consider to be the right thing. And then when you're knitting your whole garment, you're knitting so much fabric, and you are working that kind of in a relaxed way. You have relaxed into who you are as a knitter. And that may or may not be who you are as a swatcher. So what I recommend is do your swatch maybe a little bit bigger than 4 inches, maybe 6 inches. I mean, I do think you can get a fairly accurate representation with 4 inches, but make sure that you go and you knit that swatch wherever it is that you tend to knit, doing whatever else it is that you tend to do when you knit your garments. So if you are the kind of person, like I am, that's going to knit while I'm watching TV or, looking at YouTube videos or in conversation with somebody, knit your gauge swatch in that environment so that you aren't focused on the swatch. You're just knitting in your natural habitat, if it were. So that is one of the ways that you can make your swatch be more accurate for you. I think also a lot of people get into the washing and the drying of the swatch. I'm going to talk about that a little later, but I think the biggest piece of the swatch not being so accurate is that we are trying so hard to do what we think is right with our knitting, rather than just knitting the way we knit and being who we are as a knitter, and then changing the needle as we need to accommodate, our own personal style of knitting. So anyway, that's my thought on whether gauge swatches are accurate or not. Okay, let's see. What do I have next? Okay, swatches take forever. Okay, well, they don't have to. So I'm going to say that's a myth. So my thought on swatches is that, as I said, you don't have to knit an enormous gauge swatch. I mean, a smallish swatch for 4 inches is not going to take you that long to do, right? And, we like to knit, right? So what I recommend for a gauge swatch is I usually cast on some multiple of whatever number of stitches I need in 4 inches. So if my gauge is 18 stitches over 4 inches, I'm going to cast on 18 stitches or 36 stitches or 18 plus 9, which is, going to give me a 6-inch swatch. And then I cast on an extra 6 stitches, and I keep those 6 stitches on either side in garter stitch. I'll work 3 rows. I'll knit 3 rows at the beginning. I'll keep my 3 stitches at each end in garter stitch, and then I'll just work my center section in stockinette. And part of it is because it makes it easier to measure, but it also makes it a little less boring. Part of the reason we kind of hate gauge swatches is it feels like a waste of time and it's kind of boring, and we just really want to get started on our sweater. But if you do that, it keeps it from being so boring, and it's not a huge swatch. Again, you don't have to knit 8 to 10 inches or whatever. So that allows you to better measure your swatch. Because you have 18 stitches, you can immediately see whether those 18 stitches in the middle are more than 4 inches or less than 4 inches. So here's another tip that I use to keep the swatch from taking forever. So if you've cast on and you've worked your 3 knit rows and you've started your center section, and you can already see that those center stitches are larger than 4 inches. They're wider than 4 inches. Maybe they're 4.5 or 5 or whatever. But you know that your gauge is too loose because the fabric is too wide. Don't continue with that needle for 4 inches. You don't need to do that. What you want to do at that point is to knit a row on the purl side and then change the needle, go down a needle size and start again with your smaller needle. Work maybe an inch or so and you'll see, is it still too wide? If it's still too wide, go down again. But you don't have to complete a full 4-inch swatch that you can already see is going to be too wide. So that is definitely the mentality I have for keeping swatches from being too time consuming. Now, that's not necessarily true if you cast on and you knit and your swatch is too small, okay? If you cast on and you do like I've said, and you can see that you don't have 4 inches in that center section, don't give up and go to a larger needle because you are still under the influence of your cast on, which is much more firm and inflexible than the rest of your knitting. And typically when you cast on, you'll see that your knitting kind of angles out this way. That means that it is still coming into its own width. So you really do have to give it 4 inches unless you can already see that it's too large, all right? It's not necessarily too small until you get kind of out there, right? Till you have your full 4 inches. And at that point, I usually do a little trick. If I can see that at the end of my smaller needle, it comes out, I've got my 4 inches and my, however, four inches worth of rows, and it looks like it's really close on that smaller needle. It might be a tiny bit under. So instead of 4 inches, it might be just under 4. It might be, it might be just under 4. It might be 3 3/4 inches. So at that point, rather than going up a needle size and trying it there, I'm going to work it just a little bit more, and I'm going to lay it out. I'm going to steam block it. I'm going to see if I can ease that fabric out just a little bit to 4 inches. Because as a rule, you are better off having your knitting a little bit too tight than having it a little bit too loose. We all know knitted fabric stretches. Okay, so if it's just a little bit too tight, and you can ease it out to 4 inches without distorting the stitches, then you're better off with that needle. And you don't need to go to another needle and swatch it and find out that it's too big at that point. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I know that's maybe a little bit of a controversial stand on swatching, but that's how I always do it, and that's how I teach it, and I think it works beautifully. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So let's see. Susie says, I have had very good results with my recommendations for swatching. Well, that's great. I'm so glad to know that. Yay. Hey, Colleen. All right. So those are my thoughts on how you can keep a swatch from taking forever. Right? I don't think you need to knit a huge swatch. You don't need to complete a swatch if you can already see that it's going to be too large. Oh, and the other thing is you don't need to stop and cast on again and then work another 3 rows in garter. You don't have to make a brand new swatch. You can just continue on that same swatch until you find the needle that's going to work for you. When we're in the shop and we're swatching, our swatches look like this. So this is a big swatch. This is more like an 8-inch swatch. And what we do is we swatch on what we consider to be a needle a little bit smaller than the yarn recommends. And we just continue to go up, increasing the needle size so that we can see how it looks at those different gauges. this is the same kind of thing you might want to do with your swatch. Here it is on a smaller scale. This is the swatch Ginny did for the Susan shell. She had a different approach, and we have a different approach in the shop when we're swatching. We're not swatching to get gauge. We're swatching the yarn to see what it looks like at different gauges, so that when somebody comes in and they say, will this yarn work for this pattern at this gauge, we can take this gauge swatch and say, well, here is this yarn that you're considering at the gauge of the pattern you're considering. Do you like the fabric, right? So that's how we're swatching. But when you've already chosen a yarn, it's like I was saying in the newsletter this week, that's an arranged marriage. It's a done deal. You know, if you've decided I'm going to make this project and I'm going to use this yarn, you don't have the luxury at that point of saying, yeah, no, I'm going to see if I like the fabric. If you get the gauge and you like the garment that you saw completed, then it's simply a matter of asking the question, what needle size do I need to use to get that gauge? So, quick question here. Let's see. When a pattern is knitted in the round, should you knit the gauge swatch in the round? Okay, so I'm just going to talk about this very quickly because I have a whole video on this that I will link in the description. When you are knitting in the round, you might want to do a gauge swatch in the round. You will know if you need to do a gauge swatch in the round if when you look at the back side of your fabric, typically, you can see lines across it. That would indicate that you have a different gauge for your knit and purl. So if you were knitting flat like this and you held your fabric up and you could see lines in it, we don't have that because whoever knit this does not row out. Then you would know that you have a different gauge for knit and purl and you would want to swatch in the round. Okay, so I hope that helps. Okay, so yeah. So the next one that I wanted to talk about, let's look at that, is the last one. I'll run out of yarn. I'm afraid I will run out of yarn. I hear this all the time. So many knitters say, well, I don't want to swatch because I don't like to play yarn chicken and I'm terrified that I am going to run out of yarn. And I get that. Nobody wants to run out of yarn. But here's the thing. First, when you knit a pattern and you look at the size that you're going to knit, a lot of times the next size up takes the same number of skeins as the size that you are knitting. So check that because you probably have plenty of yarn. The other thing is that designers, certainly standard designers, tend to give you 10 to 20% of extra in their yarn requirements because they understand that people's tensions differ and nobody wants to be a designer that everybody's mad at because 90% of the people ran out of yarn. So typically you're going to have a little excess in there. And if none of those things is a situation for you, you can always take that gauge swatch out and have exactly the same amount of yarn that you would have had if you didn't do your gauge swatch. So I'm going to show you something that I think. So I'm going to go with that is a complete and total myth. And I want to share with you something that I did. I spent half an hour looking for this picture today. So I want to share it with you. I've heard a lot of people say, and it is absolutely true, that if your gauge swatch has been knitted for a long time and or you have blocked it, when you rip it out, the yarn is going to knit differently than it would if it were a fresh piece of yarn. And that is absolutely 100% true. So if you are in a situation where you need to rip out your gauge swatch and use that yarn to knit the rest of your fabric, there's something I want to show you how to do. Okay, let's see, and I have this here. All right, so here is what yarn looks like when it's been unknit. Whitney, this is actually your yarn from your Magnolia Bloom that we pulled out. Remember doing that? So this is what the yarn looks like. And you can see that it's kinked. And if you've ever worked with a yarn that is made this way, you know that it knits a little differently than a yarn that does not have this texture to it. And that would be highly visible in a stockinette fabric. So this is a video. I just lay that skein out and I'm going to run my steamer over it. If you don't have a steamer, you can do this exact same thing with a wet washcloth and a hot iron, just exactly as you would if you were steam blocking your swatch. So I did that, and then while it was sort of damp from the steam, I just stretched it ever the tiniest little bit. And it looked like this. And that is just like an absolutely brand new unknit piece of yarn. Let me show you the before and after. All right, so here it is after it had been unknit, and here it is after it had been steamed. So there really isn't any need to freak out about using your yarn from your swatch, even if you have blocked your swatch, or even if that swatch has been knitted for a really long time. So that's just a little trick that you can use. You can also like wet block it, but you would need to kind of hang it and stretch it a little bit. I think the steam blocking works beautifully. You can see the kinks relax when you run that steamer over them, and it is just remarkable. So yeah, so don't ever worry about doing a gauge swatch because you think you're going to run out of yarn. You always have that yarn, and if you kind of unblock the yarn after you've pulled it out, it's going to knit up just fine, just like a brand new piece of yarn. So anyway, so that is my take on swatches. At the end, yes, you should always swatch for a sweater. It doesn't have to be a big deal, okay? You don't have to make it a big production. It doesn't have to be like so perfect, you know, if it's a quarter of a stitch over 4 inches under, or a half a stitch, or, you know, maybe even 1 stitch under. If you can ease it out or block it out very gently to the size that you need it to be, you are in tall cotton. Everything is fine. You're not going to have to worry about it, because we know knitwear stretches. You know, it's going to stretch, and it's really not going to be a huge deal. But do swatch, because if it's too large and, you know, the fabric is floppier than it's supposed to be, you're not going to be happy with it. And if it's too small, such that you really do have to distort the fabric, when I say ease it out, I mean just sort of ease it like that, you know, just a little bit. But if you're having to distort the fabric to get it to 4 inches, see what I mean? Distort the fabric, see how that's getting all wide? That would be too much. So that's my thought on swatching, and those are the facts versus the myths and why you should do it. So if this video has been helpful for you, I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment. I answer every single comment that I get, and I love hearing from you. And thank you for being here live tonight. I love seeing you. It's so good to have people besides just my camera. So yay, thank you very much. All right, good night, and I will see you next time. Happy knitting.